Hey folks, Rudros here, ready for another Final Fantasy Friday, the last one of 2023. And today is all about the keyword warp, the newest mechanic introduced in 2023 to the Final Fantasy trading card game. Is it any good? Is it worth using? We're going to discuss it here in a second. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Hit that bell for notifications if you aren't subscribed already. There will be new Final Fantasy videos out every single Friday for Final Fantasy Friday. I really appreciate it. Helps the channel grow. Come on, help me get to 1,000 subs. That's the goal, baby. All right, so we are going to talk about warp today. This was the big new mechanic, and we've had a full year with it, so how good is it, right? Well, let's talk about it. As you can see in the background here, this was the original article. So this came out October 27th, 2022. So yes, we've had an absolute full year with warp. This was the original article debuting it with the legend Theodore, and he will definitely come up here. So what is warp? It's going to list in this article. I'm going to link the article in the description below. In the meantime, let me give you a quick summary. You pay the warp cost during your main phase, then the card in hand is removed from the game with the listed number of counters on it. At the start of every main phase 1, you will remove a warp counter from the card, and when it has no more counters on it, the card enters play. Again, if you want every detailed explanation, feel free to check out this article, but that's your basic summary. So I did a count here on FFdex and just saw how many cards total do we have with warp on it. And again, remember, this came out at the end of last year, so we've had a full year. And so far, there are 28 cards with the warp text on it. Now, technically, there are 3 other cards that mention the word warp. Vayne, the legend Vayne, he himself doesn't warp, but again, he has text that interacts with warp. You have this knocked card that I don't think I saw anybody ever use, but technically if a forward enters due to warp, he gets some effect, but again, he doesn't have warp himself. You have Sid 2, he's a backup. He searches for a card with a warp, with the warp text, and then he can also remove a warp counter. Those are the 3. They do list Noctis here because Opus 8 Noctis has a special called Warp Strike, so the word warp shows up in here, but he's not there. So you have 28 cards, not counting Sid, Noctis, Noct, and Vayne, that actually have the warp text on them. Now, out of 28 cards, which is awful low for a new mechanic, I think, even lower than the crystals, within 3 sets of the crystals, and they've printed much more since then, there was a total of 50 cards, and 3 sets with warp, only 28. So it's not a very well supported mechanic. Presumably it will get more support in the future, but if that support looks like some of these cards, like Monk, then I don't know how good that support is. So overall, big theme of this is that I don't think warp is very good as a keyword. I don't think it's used very well. I don't think they've designed around it very well, and I think even within 3 sets, there's cards like this Monk, this Rain, just aren't very good, and it feels like they just slapped it on there like, well, we gotta use that warp keyword here, this Tifa, so let's warp it. And now why is that, though? Let's explore that. Let's explore what is good warp, what is bad warp. Is there any good warp? As a matter of fact, there is. I think there are 6 cards that use warp that are actually good. And those 6 cards are, in no particular order, Beldat, Mist, Golbez, Prish, Garnet, and Estinian. Okay, what makes those cards good versus everything else, right? Let's dive into that. So Estinian and Garnet are the only 2 really good warp cards where the delayed value of the warp gives you a benefit that offsets the downside of the warp. Whereas the other 4, Prish, Golbez, Mist, and Beldat, their warp is good because they give you incremental value. They give you continued value by warping them, so you're not just waiting for the warp effect to come in. And as a matter of fact, I think that's one of the biggest mistakes of warp. To get good value off of these cards, you must warp them, and Theodore is the prime example of that. Here is what warp should be. Warp should be a tactical choice a player gets to make in the game. What warp currently is a requirement to get the card at good value. And we're going to use Theodore as an example of this because he is the poster child for this. So Theodore, quick refresher. If your opponent has 2 cards or less in their hand, he gains 2,000 power, haste, and first strike. When he enters the field, your opponent discards 2 cards. If he enters due to warp, your opponent discards 1 card. So when he enters due to warp, which costs 2 ice and he has to wait 2 turns for that to go off, he essentially discards a grand total of 3 cards from your hand. Now, why does this suck? Because he is vastly overpriced at 9 CP. Compare him to his counterpart, which is Opus 8 Sephiroth. Sephiroth, for 7 CP, when he enters the field, your opponent discards 2 cards. Exact same as Theodore. If he enters the field, your opponent discards 2 cards. So in order for Theodore to get more value than Sephiroth, you have to warp him. Because otherwise, if he's just discarding 2 cards, why would you play him over Sephiroth? He costs 2 more. You're paying 2 more for the exact same effect. Now, Sephiroth also obviously has a dull freeze he can contribute to as well as an insane special, which is what made that card so strong back in the day. Yeah, if you were to just cast this card naturally for 9, if that's your game plan, there is no reason to ever do that over Sephiroth. So, to get value out of him, to get Opus 18, Opus 21, about to be 22 now, worth of value, you have to warp this card. What did I say earlier about warp? It should be a tactical choice a player gets to make in a game. Well, if you are forced to warp him, if you must warp him to benefit from this card, then you're not actually making a choice. You have to pay the 2. You don't want to pay 9 for this. And that just goes against, to me, what should be the spirit of warp. You should get that decision. Do I pay the 2, have the delay, and then I get this big benefit? Or, you know what, I can just use him for his normal cost. You can't use Theodore for his normal cost because he's insanely overpriced at 9 CP. Currently, here are the benefits of warping. Cheaper cost. That's it. That's the main benefit of warping if you look at all these warp cards. Some cards also get extra value when you warp them, and this is what it should be. Warping should give you extra value. Some examples of this are the ones I mentioned earlier: Mist, Estinian, Beldat, Garnet, Prish, Golbez. A few of the ones I didn't mention that don't actually see play is the Luna Freya from Opus 18, as well as Zack here, as well as Luna Freya from Opus 20. And to clarify what I mean is that if you were to play Luna Freya normally for 4, your opponent selects a 4 they control, put them into the break zone. However, if she enters due to warp, in addition to that, you now get another effect where you get to bounce that forward to their hand. So there is a clear benefit to warping Luna Freya over playing her naturally. Same with Genesis. Genesis only gets one of his 2 actions, freeze 2 characters or random discard, if he were to enter naturally. But if he enters due to warp, now you get both actions automatically. So there is a clear benefit to warping Genesis. Unfortunately, that benefit is terrible. Because the downsides of warping, the biggest one possible, is the delayed information. This is backbreaking. You have seen some of the games going on in Opus 21, and even Opuses before this. If you're going against an aggro deck and you are dead in 2 to 3 turns, you don't have time to wait for a warp to finish. Imagine you're playing against Category 13. They open Hope Vanille. Get the lightning in hand. Turn 1, you warp Theodore. Okay, next turn. Here comes lightning. Boom, 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 boom. Turn 2, your Theodore drops 1 counter. Turn 3, they finish you off. You're dead. You're dead. That card won't even come into play by the time the game is over. And I don't think they properly value just how awful that is, that you have this massive delay to bring these cards in. And not only that, it's delayed information. It is known information. That's one of the biggest things with Theodore. You are advertising to your opponent, hey, I'm going to take 3 cards out of your hand. So what do most people do when a Theodore comes in? They either save up the Amaterasu, or they just play their entire hand out, so you essentially don't get value off of him anyway. Imagine you are throwing a party and you have one friend who's always late and is supposed to bring the liquor over, but then the party's over by the time they get there. Like, that doesn't benefit anybody if by the time they get to the party's already over. Same with warping and the way it works in the game. And think about this, the turn you use it, so Theodore as an example, you have paid 2 CP and you have lost a card in hand with no immediate benefit. You just said pay 2, so you likely pitched a card from hand, and you gave up another card. You essentially discarded 2 cards for no immediate value. That's huge. That is a huge downside, and it's a big reason why this mechanic has suffered so much, because the delay in these cards entering is simply backbreaking. Now I want to look at the 2 cards that I think do warp well, and I think these cards actually work with warp. And these are Garnet and Estinian. So we'll start with Garnet. Garnet, 3 cost 8k, warp, 2 turns, pay an earth and a water to do it. When she enters the field, choose a summon in your break zone, add it to your hand. If she enters the field due to warp, choose a summon in your break zone, add it to hand. Garnet and Estinian are both playable at their normal costs. However, the warp is a strategic risk that offers an even greater payoff if it succeeds. Garnet recurring 2 summons on entry is effectively 4 CP to your hand, plus the power of whatever summons you choose, which is a great return when you only paid 2 CP to warp her. The upside of the warp has to override the incredible downside of having to wait 2 turns. 2 turns that your opponent knows what is coming and they can prepare for it. I think Garnet hits that mark. Now look at Estinian. 4 cost, 8,000, warp 1 turn for a single lightning, has haste. When he attacks until the end of the turn, 10,000 power first strike. If he enters due to warp, can attack twice and gains brave that turn. Estinian only has to wait a single turn to come in, and it only costs 1 to warp him. The card is meant to attack and be a beater. If you take the warp route, he makes up for the turn you took off waiting for him by giving you a second attack. So over 2 turns, an Estinian can give you 2 attacks. You get to choose. Do you play him normally and hope he lasts through 2 attacks? Or do you take the turn off to give your opponent some prep time, but you potentially get the 2 attacks for only 1 CP. There is a real choice here that gives you, the player, a decision to make. That is how warp should work. You can happily just play Estinian for a full 4 and immediately get an attack in, or you can take that little risk and wait a little longer to have a payoff that equals you waiting for a cheaper cost. I think the absolute maximum amount of time a card can warp is 2 turns. Anything beyond 2 turns is unplayable, and even 2 turns is asking a lot. You rarely see Garnet get warped, even though she offers a great reward. Even Estinian is one of the first cards cut from Scion's lists, because even a single turn can give your opponent the ability to negate the value of the card. Anything that wants more than warp 2 has to give you continued value while warped. Examples of this being Mist or Golbez. If you look at Mist, Beldat, Golbez, and Preesh, these are cards that give you value while waiting for the warp to end. These cards give you different value from the warp. Instead of just a delay and then a payoff once it's done warping, these cards give you value every time they lose a warp counter, or instantly in Prish's case. Mist, Prish, and Beldat can all be cast for their normal cost to still get relevant effects, or you can go for the delay and an entirely different set of value. To be fair, Golbez is a bit strange that you likely never want to hard cast him, so he almost demands to be warped, but at least he makes up for it by giving insane value for each turn he's gone if you're able to capitalize off the warp counters. It's clear what the original intent for warp was. You get a card on a delay, but it's always cheaper than its normal cost. But I don't think the designers realize just how big of a downside waiting for a card to give you value is. Warping should always be a strategic option that fits nicely in the risk versus reward field. But since waiting is inherently a high risk, the reward must be high as well. And the card must be playable in its normal state. If the card is only at the right CP cost when you warp it, then you've lost all decision making related to what should be a thoughtful, choice-based mechanic. Waiting for a turn in this game is such a big downside that you have to have massive upside in order to make it worth it. Estinian only has to wait a single turn, and I cannot count the amount of games where Estinian tries to come in and, oh, there's Cuchulainn the Impure, blank him. You didn't get value off of it anyway. Oh, there's the Amaterasu. Up, there's card XYZ that just dealt with him immediately, and that's only waiting 1 turn. Again, Garnet has an incredible upside if you were to get her warp, but you rarely see that happen. The only time I've seen people use that warp is when they are either even or ahead in the game, and so they can kind of afford to. It's like, hey, now it's just going to pile on that much more when she comes in. You can't afford to do that if you're behind, and arguably not even too. So I like the idea of the mechanic. I really do, but they have really missed the mark on it with a lot of these cards. Look at Rain. You have to wait 2 turns to get a 7k ping. Otherwise, without the warp, he's just a 3-cost 7k haste. That's unplayable in Opus 21. And clearly with the warp, even if he warped I don't know, like, even if you had to pay 4 and he just dealt 7 with haste, would that even be playable? Maybe just because he's a knight, so maybe in that specific package? That's terrible. Look at this monk. Warp 2 turns for a black belt, for a card that has no text other than Brave. That's insanity. It doesn't matter. It's 3 cheaper with the warp. You have to wait 2 turns to get him in. Look at this Tifa. You have to warp. It costs 2. You have to wait 3 whole turns for what? A 5 cost 9k with Brave that can attack twice. A card that if you played normally, if you paid a full 5 for it, sits there, does nothing the moment you play it, and will attack twice if it lives to the next turn, and that's assuming it can actually attack through whatever your opponent has. That's insane. That's awful, awful value. It doesn't have to be that way. This can be a cool mechanic. We see it with cards like the Prish, like the Golbez, even cards like Vayne that, while it doesn't warp directly, enables it in some way. But the delay is just too long. We have to cut these delays down. Anything beyond 2 is essentially unplayable. As a final side note, yes, warp is probably a little better in draft or in a sealed environment where resources are a bit more limited, removal's a bit more limited, the game maybe doesn't go as quickly, so you can afford to wait those longer turns. But I mainly look at Final Fantasy through a standard constructed lens, which is the most common tournament type that is run in this game. There wasn't a single draft at any of the Materia Cups that was like for placement for national seeding. So until they start making draft and sealed events a regular part of that, I'm just not going to analyze it from that perspective. All right, so what do you think? What are some of your favorite warp cards? Are they one of the 6 I mentioned? Is there one I overlooked? How do you feel about the mechanic? What is the maximum amount of time you are willing to wait for a warp card? Is there anything I missed? Anything I didn't think about? How would you like to see warp implemented in the future? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great 2024. And until next time, take care.